Thanks so much, everybody. I'm Ali Jones, and I'm doing my PhD here in between German politics and history. I'm working on a group of people called the Autonomen. But what I'm going to do here is run you through a bit of a background, historical view over ideas of violence within the radical German left since '68. Quick note on questions before we start. I'd really prefer questions at the end. If you have questions like you don't understand what's going on, totally put up your hand. That's fine. I do want to make note that it's really personally enjoyable and gratifying for an audience member to find like a ideological contradiction within anarchism. And I know that's really fun to do, but it's not the most helpful. For example, the question I get almost every presentation is, anarchists wear shoes, therefore they're wrong. And that's really enjoyable, but let's try to keep the questions constructive and interesting so we can have a really good discussion, because they do wear shoes. I concede the point. But it's getting really old. Cool, so if you don't understand something, throw your hand up. Otherwise, all of your questions are very welcome at the end. So I'm just going to start out with a bit of context here. Is anyone in the room a historian or a philosopher or a political theorist? Cool. Oh, yes.
I'm a historian.
We have one.
Nothing to do with this.
We have none. All right. Cool. So this is a quote from Anonymous number 2. He's in his 50s now. He's been an anarchist and been involved in the radical German left and been imprisoned for terrorism twice. And he gave me this beautiful, beautiful quote where he says, you just have to understand the massive amounts of changes that are happening as of 1967. He says, in 1967, everything was nice and quiet. By 1974, you've got this explosion of social movements and political violence and terrorism. You've got, as we'll see, terrorists attacking the state, blowing up department stores, hijacking people, murdering people. And this is in a very, very short 7-year period. So there's this radical change, and then I'm going to try to whip you through that as a bit of a background context. I hope it's not too fast. So first of all, there are generally 2 forms of violence within political theory, give or take Zizek. They're either known as subjective or objective, also known as ultra-subjective and ultra-objective, which is the same thing but a different philosopher. What do you guys think? Who knows what subjective violence is? How about objective violence? No audience? No, good. Okay. Basically, it's pretty straightforward. Subjective violence is like I punch you in the face, or I invade your country and shoot you with a gun. It's pretty straightforward violence from one agent to another agent, or violence or force applied from a person to another person or an object. Whereas objective violence, which is what this talk is going to be about, there's 2 forms, according to Zizek, who occasionally says smart things once in a long while. Nobody gets my jokes. Oh, man. Damn scientists. The first one is symbolic violence, which is the violence of language hidden in the way we communicate. So, for example, there's a philosopher named Habermas who says everybody has a reasonable voice and an equal say. And then another person would come along and say, well, no, because colored people or immigrants or people with disabilities don't have access to the same conversation table. They either don't have the cultural capital to go to university, or they can't go talk to an MP because the MP won't talk to a homeless person. So there's a violence and there's an inequality hidden in language and hidden in the very words we get to use because of the opportunities we have that other people don't have, and that's a kind of violence. And then there's systemic violence, which is the violence. It's often invisible, and it's sort of hidden in our economic and political systems. So these are very similar kinds of violence. I'm going to give you a bunch of examples now to make this a little bit more concrete. When humans cause destruction of habitat, when humans cause global warming and entire countries turn into deserts. That's a kind of violence against those people. When X government causes a flood in Y country and those people all drown and die. That's a kind of violence caused by a system. That's not an accident, and that's not me punching you in the face, but it's more dissipated. It's more spread out. Social services are eliminated and people can't get hospital services and they die. That's a violence, but who's to blame? All of these kinds of violence is, I can't say you, Charlie, punched me. It's more like, your government changed the rules and 10 years later we all died, but there's no one person that we can point to. It's spread out. A lot of this is tied to a philosopher named Foucault, and if you haven't read him, he's pretty fantastic and he writes about science a lot. You might really like him. And this sort of spread out structural forms is sort of his shtick. I won't get into him much here, even though he's super relevant and really fantastic to read. So things like the IMF, colonialization, class oppression, capitalism, these are all kinds of objective violence. Against objective violence, we have something called counterviolence. Now, counterviolence has changed a lot since 1967. I'm going to try to run you through two of the older forms, and then I'm going to say this is the alley thesis of a new kind of counterviolence and why this is important for today. But really briefly, so you know what I'm talking about, I'd say these are the two most important theorists of counterviolence and radical protest. Anyone ever heard of Rudi Dutschke? Yes, the German. Anyone heard of Ulrike Meinhof? Okay, so the German and the Germanophile. Rudi Dutschke was one of the most important student leaders of 1968, even though he wasn't there because he'd been shot. So 1968 is a year, or a 2 or 3 month period, where most of Europe had revolutions. Basically, France, the government basically fell. The whole country went on strike. The unions joined the students. Everybody marched through the streets. De Gaulle's government was about to fall. It was a huge revolution. In Germany, it lasted 10 years, 67 to 77. So it wasn't just contained in a 2 month period. And those 10 years are the 10 years I'm talking about, where we have terrorism exploding. This whole context has to be understood in what happened on June 2nd, 1967. Now, June 2nd, there are whole terrorist movements named the June 2nd movement because they were so angry about what went on here. In very, very short, the Shah of Iran was installed by a CIA coup after the previous democratically elected leader was ousted because he nationalized the oil reserves. The USA didn't like this, so they installed a dictator that would not nationalize the oil reserves. Students protested against this because he was visiting Berlin and he was killing and torturing his own people. His wife was engaged in questionable action, so they were holding up signs protesting. I'm going to show you the clip in a second. What followed was the most brutal street battle in Berlin since the Second World War. And the police chief used what he called Leberwurst tactics, and he said, let's stab them in the middle so their ends squirt out. You guys all read the disclaimer, trigger warning, much as I hate the term. So there's going to be some scenes of violence here, and I hope that's okay. If it's not okay, then maybe you might want to step out and grab a coffee. So the Shah of Iran is visiting in Berlin, a very lovely procession. There's protesters behind a fence, and this is a pretty accurate representation. They're behind a fence, they're holding signs, they're chanting, they're being quite rude because they're protesting, but there's no violence. They're shouting murderer. These men here holding these signs are not actually guards. The German police had allowed the Iranians to bring in their own security forces. So the German state said, you can bring in your foreign police forces into our country and do whatever you like to our citizens. And so this really exploded, as I'll just let you watch the rest of the clip. So these are Iranian secret police posing as pro-Shah demonstrators. Yeah. This goes on for quite a while. It's chaos. Here's the clip. Here we go. The German police join in and start beating up the protesters along with the Iranian secret police. And then a young man is murdered. His name was Bene Ohnesorge. He was in his mid-20s, and it was his first demonstration ever. And his young wife at home was pregnant, which was pretty difficult for a lot of people to deal with, because the murder had been basically coming from the state, I would say, because the people should have a democratic right to protest, or at least the left thought of it that way. As a result, a lot of people got very, very, very angry. This is the photo at the time. Actually, my friend's dad took this picture, and I'm trying to get the photo rights, and I'm hoping I can. So he's murdered at this demonstration where the secret police from another country I don't know if you know this, but it's illegal and it's against the principle of sovereignty for one country's police to operate in another country like that. Like, that's completely impossible under international law. But the German police said, yeah, bring in your secret police, no problem. And then let them attack their citizens without much provocation. So, huge scandal. As a result, Dutschke, who was actually a pretty hardcore Christian and generally advocated peace up until this point, began to advocate counterviolence. He said, look, we're under attack. We need to react with violence when it comes from above. Like, we can react with violence to violence. We shouldn't instigate, but when they start it, then we have to fight back. So this is the start of a major change in the movement that until now had advocated peaceful sit-ins, holding signs, chanting, marches, petitions, etc. So this is the start of what we're going to see. This got a lot harsher very, very, very quickly with Ulrike Meinhof, the second picture. She later became a terrorist, and we'll get to that. The next year, so 1967 was the year when this shooting happened. The next year in the spring, Rudi Dutschke was shot in the head because newspapers using systemic violence, remember the violence of language, were calling this man needs to be killed. People need to go out and shoot him, do your country a service and destroy this man. The left will destroy us all. Get out there and kill him. He's a traitor. And so a young right-wing pro-Nazi radical shot him in the head, which is another action against which the left felt they needed to fight back. So you again have this counter-violence entering this spiral. Ulrike Meinhof, there's hundreds of books written on her, but in very, very short, she's, I guess, most famous for this quote. Protest is when I say that I don't like something. Resistance is when I make sure it doesn't happen again. And so you have a change here, a change from sort of standing against to actively going out and changing things. And I would say that this is the start of where counter-violence starts to change and fall away. But that's the Alley thesis, and we'll get there. But you start to have a belief within the German left that protest and democratic protest and petitions are toothless and don't do much. She then, soon after, joined, does anyone know the Red Army faction? Anyone ever heard of them? Super famous terrorists all through the German 1970s, like movie star type of terrorism. This is her, Ulrike Meinhof, and then one of the other top leaders, a guy named Baader. So you have this shooting, this murder of a young boy at a protest. This next year, emergency laws were passed, and these emergency laws were really, really similar to a lot of the emergency laws that Hitler had used to come to power. So you have a German left saying, okay, we were marching peacefully, you murdered us, you attacked us, secret police from another country attacked us, and then you passed the same law Hitler used to come to power. This is getting really scary. A couple of years later, the Chancellor, and the Chancellor was Willy Brandt. He was known as the peace Chancellor. He was really well liked. Even the left really liked him because he wanted to make peace with the communists and talk to them, and East and West Germany were separated, and he said, no, we should talk, we should cooperate more. People really liked him. But even he passed a law saying that anyone who'd ever signed an environmental petition or joined an organization for, clean water was now subject to a background check. And if you were found to have these associations, you would lose your job. So 3.5 million Germans were subject to background checks for ever signing, Greenpeace stops you on the street and you sign their form, you've now lost your job. So again, the German left is feeling really attacked here, and they feel like they need to do something in response. I'm not excusing what they did. Their violence was horrific and horrible. But this is the context of why they thought that way. A few years later, the criminal code was updated, making it now illegal to have any support for a criminal organization, or obviously to be a part of a criminal organization. But this extended in some pretty ironic ways, actually. There was one terrorist who had engaged in terrorism, then wrote a book about how he ultimately decided this is a terrible idea, I shouldn't be killing people, and violence is wrong. And that book was the #1 book censored by this law. And so the secret police went in and found all the copies of the book and arrested all the editors and threw them all in jail and raided bookstores to take away this book where the guy was like, terrorism is bad and fails in the end. Like, that was his conclusion. So it was funny at the time. So as examples, again, of this objective violence, there's economic forms. Again, changes in this time. Remember the first quote where he said it's a huge period of change in German society. An economic policy changed. What we would now call very corporate emphasizing neoliberalism came into play. There was a war, so the price of crude oil shot up. The economy collapsed. Unemployment started to rise. People were out of work. The government, which used to be relatively left-wing, moved to the right and started implementing austerity measures. You also had the first generation since the Second World War, which is the first generation where everyone could go to university. So whereas university used to be very select and just for an elite few, now everybody had a degree. So you had millions of people graduating all at once with degrees and no jobs because the economy's gone to hell. So you have a huge disenfranchisement going on. So there's economic forms, security forms. In the midst of this economic collapse, in the midst of cutting the social programs, no one has jobs, there's no housing. They increased police spending by 500% the secret police grew by 170%. And then again, these emergency laws that had the same feel as Hitler. So people were feeling really, really attacked. And then there's a third kind of objective violence that I haven't mentioned so far, which is urban restructuring. I'm going to move now into our case study so we can talk about what we're actually here to talk about. But urban restructuring, does anyone know what gentrification is? Yeah, so a state's intentional plan to change the demographic of a neighborhood and a piece of city, generally to raise land values, but also to push out lower income people, especially homeless or undesirable people as such, and to get economically higher class, more appealing people in. That's basically gentrification. So this started to happen. There was a neighborhood in Hamburg, which is the neighborhood that I'm working on and have been for 5 years. It's a very small neighborhood. It's half a square kilometer. It had about 2,500 residents, and it was low-income seniors, workers, immigrants, students. It had basically been left behind after the war. It was still standing, but was in very poor shape. So it was very, very, very poor and thus affordable for all these people. 1988, the state said, we're going to take this neighborhood and we're going to turn it into an entertainment district. We're going to build a huge music hall, the Crystal Palace, for 2,000 people. We're going to bring 2,000 people every night to musicals and shows and operas here. And we're going to raise the land values, absolutely. And this is all written down in a document that the left-wing people then got a hold of and could read and could see these very explicit plans to get them out of their neighborhood because it was written down in government policy. The citizens, and this is a quote from the mayor, the citizens feared that they would be herausaniert, like cleaned out of their neighborhood, like forced out, but cleaned out. So they started to write petitions, they started demonstrating, marching, signing papers, trying to meet with the mayor, writing letters. And so the mayor eventually wrote a letter saying, look, I know you're fearing that you're going to be cleaned out of this neighborhood because we don't want you here anymore, but I fixed the problem, don't worry. Instead of 500 parking spots, we're going to just make 260. It'll be fine. So the people weren't very happy about this. And again, remember how peaceful protest turns to violence when people feel like they're being attacked in these forms of systemic and structural violence? This is what happened here. So after all the peaceful methods didn't work, they joined up with these guys in the black masks, which are called the autonomes or the autonomists in English. And they started to demonstrate, and they started to attack things, and they started to sabotage things, and they started burning construction equipment, and they started burning police cars and police stations and fire trucks. And within about a year, it worked. The Crystal Palace Music Hall wasn't built, it was moved someplace else. And they occupied the building. And they said, no, this is not going to be used for a music concert hall where we can't even afford the tickets. This is going to be used for culture, and this is going to be used for the neighborhood. So they turned it into a neighborhood cultural center. Of course, this was coupled with a very, very radical left-wing ideology. So it wasn't just for your mom and your sister to go to, although at first it was, but in the end it wasn't. So it's called the Rote Flora. And so this is what I've been working on, and the people who populate this are called the Black Bloc, or the Autonomen, so those people who wear the black masks and are willing to engage in this type of violence, this type of counter-violence, as they call it. And they occupy this building, and they started to form what became, I would call it quite a cult-like group, a very ideological absolutist group. And in the end, I think it became quite destructive, but in the beginning, they really meant well. So why did things change, and what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say, because remember that violence had two forms over here, subjective and objective, and then there were two types of objectives, so language, economy, security, urban stuff, right? What I'm going to argue, and what I do argue in my PhD, is that in the context of what happened, which I'll turn to quite quickly, people turned away from these types of political protest and terrorism and violence. And they turn towards something that I'm going to call structural violence. The context for this, very briefly, is, remember these guys? Ulrike Meinhof that we saw earlier, and Bada, and then this is Enslin, looking quite happy and being quite revolutionary. And then another associate here named Holger Mainz. These were the terrorists. These were rock stars in the German left. These were BMW driving, fancy clothes wearing celebrities. So they all died horrifically in 1977 when they were kidnapped. They were in prison. They'd been in prison for several years, and their associates hijacked a plane to try to free them and said, "We've hijacked the plane. We'll let all these people go if you let our 3 leaders go." Instead, the 3 leaders were found dead the next morning. Now, the German left says it's murder, the German state says it's suicide. I'm not taking a stance. I do know there are medical reports on this woman, Ulrike Meinhof, who, I don't have a picture of her anymore, sorry. Here she is, yeah. Who was, if a radical and a bit paranoid, a mother, an intellectual, sort of the life of the party. She was found hung in her cell. And she'd been in isolation for years, and when the state refused to give any reason, they got enough lawyers together that they could make an independent investigation. And finally, at this independent medical investigation, they found that she'd been raped and strangled in isolation, which makes the claims of suicide something I'm still not willing to take a stance on as a historian, but there was a lot of really, really horrible things going on in 1977. These people died brutally. So, within this context of their deaths, I'm going to argue the alley thesis that we have a turning away from these acts of terrorism and from these acts of avant-garde revolutionary ideas. And we've got a turning towards something that I'm calling the formation of the self and the formation of the subject. Now, if you read that Foucault guy that I mentioned, this comes from him. And this directly comes from him because he was talking to the autonomists in 78. They were reading him, he was talking to them. But the idea is that one turns away from an outward stance, such as Marxism or the revolution or changing the world, and towards making the subject and making the self a counterviolent subject, someone who individually can resist society, because attempts at revolution and attempts at terrorism ended horribly. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. So you have this group, the Rote Flora, which is occupied by a group of people who come from this whole lineage and this whole background. They've been engaged for 20, 30 years in these acts of terrorism. They all failed, everybody died. And now they say, okay, we've occupied this building. We're going to try to make ourselves the revolution because we obviously can't make a revolution out there. Is everybody on board? Yeah, any questions so far? Cool. So I'm going to call this structural violence. And structural violence is simply another way of saying objective violence, but it's nice to have a different word for it to differentiate the time periods. Now the difference here is that this is obsessed with the self rather than with the state. It's also really, really important to know there was an important theory called the 3:1, or the 3-to-1 form of oppression. So these people said, the objective violence we were talking about before, these 3 most important types of that are capitalism, so the oppression of us as a class, which is, questionable because they weren't necessarily workers, but that was the time. Number 2, the oppression of women and sexism, which is pretty spot on. Women are treated pretty poorly at this time, and, women making accusations of assault or trying to access legal services generally have less access than men do, which is, I'd say, historical fact. And 3, racism, sometimes called anti-Semitism. They interchange the words. Of course, Nazism, the Holocaust, that's what this is about, but also immigrants are starting to become an issue. So you've got this threefold focus on oppression and this structural violence, and then they attempt to make the self the new form of counterviolence rather than the revolution. Big changes in society at this time. So you're not, this is what I just said, you're not locating the resistance in outside actions, but in inside actions. And what's going to be really important here is this had to be a really pure ideological process. So there was a really heavy emphasis on absolute purity, absolute consistency, the idea that you had to be completely ideologically coherent. You couldn't have any contradictions, even if you wore shoes, oh God. And that's what we're going to get into with some of the violence issues that are coming up. If anyone has studied Greek history at all, there's a very heavy aesthetic impulse to this. So like the denial of the self, no drinking, no drugs, very pure, straight-laced, straight-edgers. That sort of movement is linked to this. Okay, so we just talked about this. Structural violence, new form of counterviolence, happened in this context, happens in the self, isn't about society. So these are the autonomes. This is what I do all day. I track these people down in hiding, sometimes in jail, sometimes in middle-class homes with lawn gnomes. That was the biggest surprise. I was just like, how you did this and you have a gnome? But before lawn gnomes, before they all had children, this is what they looked like and this is what they did. This is a demo in Hamburg. So these are them. They're quite violent, but never against people. There's a very, very strict rule, and you're not allowed to ever kill a person because of this heritage. But there is very much a complex of the lone hero fighting the system by being a black-clad revolutionary resistant figure, and a lot of it is purely ideological, and a lot of it is purely symbolic. Now, what is autonomy? Very, very briefly, I'd say they would say, when I asked them, they said it's self-determination, self-formation, and self-governance. So making the self, being in charge of the self, and deciding the self for oneself and not having outside influences. So do you start to see how this isn't about the state telling us what to do, this is about us telling us what to do. And it becomes increasingly more important that you decide for yourself, and any influences or any contamination, any infiltration from the outside will be viewed then as making you dirty, ruining your coherence, really, really contaminating you. And these are not my words. These are the words they're using in their interviews. They said we had to be pure. But that's a really, really interesting turn for a bunch of anarchists who have sworn off religion since 50 years. This is focused on purity and on no contamination from the outside. You have to make yourself perfect. And this pressure that they put themselves under to be perfect, to be perfectly ideologically, purely revolutionary in the self, became, I'd say, a little bit too much in the end. This is tied to the formation of pure and sacred spaces, which David would remember I talked about 3 years ago. But we're not going to get into that here because we just don't have time. So this is what it looked like a year ago. They've since painted it, and I don't like the paint job. And the artist who did the paint job stood me up 4 times. So I'm going to show you the old picture because he's rude. Some of these are quotes from, these are all from number 16. Number 16 made the Flora. Number 16 was there at the beginning. She was one of the people who squatted it. She was there for 10 years. She was, I'd say, one of the 3 or 4 most important people in the whole project. She's also a wonderful person, really lovely. And I talked to her about this, and she said, yeah, no, we did this because we really believed that we had this purity of ideology. This idea could be manifested in us, in our very most beings, in our innermost beings, in our innermost selves. So it's really this idea about making oneself an idea. They also believed they were doing it for moral reasons. She said, we thought we were the better people. We thought we were trying to build a better world. She said, I was trying to save the world, and I thought this was how to do it. But she said, look, as a result, we were really, really deeply sensitive to certain topics. And so anytime anyone said anything that could be interpreted, and then she stops and says, we were just trying to save the world. We really were trying to be the better people. But she said, anytime anyone said anything, the PC police came out in full force and checked everything to make sure everything was consistent and coherent and matched. And if anyone said the wrong thing or used a slang or used a derogatory term or had a different position, then they couldn't belong here. We had to kick them out. They had to go. And this kicking out process was often extremely violent, which is where we'll get to that in a bit. So what happens then when you have a group so determined on this internal consistency? And what happens when that is transgressed? I will talk now about a brief example. There was a band called Heitebes Fulkik. They had a tour in 1994, and that tour played in this building to this group of people. They are a punk cabaret band. They're quite... Do you remember Adam Sandler? You old enough for Adam Sandler? Yeah. It's like Adam Sandler in the 80s with punk rock. It's terrible. See, I've got a couple of clips here so you see what I'm talking about. It's kind of dumb. This is their hit. Okay.
Liebe Kinder, hallo liebe TV-Fans, jetzt geht's
Hey TV-Fans!
Wir senden live aus dem Underground.
We're talking to you live from the underground. Do you know there's something more fun than TV? And then you get terrible music and cabaret and silly comedy. Yeah, this is the band. This is their hit, Hey Rote Zora, and the Rote Zora were a group of female and feminist terrorists in the 70s. So it's a callback to that sort of radical time period in that politics. I wonder if I can do, yeah. So can you still see that? They don't have to double switch. So in '94, these guys played a concert in the Flora, and it included 3 skits that caused a Germany-wide debacle and chaos. I found all 3 skits on the internet. We're doing okay for a time, yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can play you little short 30 seconds snippets of each one. If you want to see them, it would maybe provide context. There are scenes of penises. They are fake. If anyone has a problem, you can grab a coffee. It's really not, I personally do not find it threatening. Okay, so here is the first one, which is ridiculous. It's called Telephone Sex. She's saying, hi, please wait, the time is 5:45. Please wait. And then, yeah, that's it. She just says, please wait, the time is 5:45, over and over and over again. That's it, that's the end. And then there's a song, the chorus of which is, I have problems orgasming, I have problems orgasming. But that's it. So that was the first skit. Huge problems. It was called Rape throughout the movement. This is the second skit that caused a huge problem. You're going to see penises here. How exciting. They did a striptease with women's clothing on and large fake genitalia. Goes on for 15 or so minutes. Yeah. Oh, the 80s and the 90s. So that's the second one. This is the third one. This one's actually pretty funny. Well, no, I take that back. This is not funny at all. But it's a parody of a German soap opera, like a conservative soap opera that ran for 20 years, called Lindenstraße.
Deutschland 1997.
Yeah.
Der Krieg geht ins 2. Jahr. Der Feind steht kurz vor Schwabing. Familie Weimar ist wieder vereint.
Okay, so this is the context. This is the mother, and this is the father, and he's been asking her to have sex with him, to penetrate him. He's been asking her to over and over again, and so she does with a spoon. And, oh my God, where did the spoon go? I'm gonna puke. Oh, he pukes out a spoon. That's it. What a death for me. So, those are the skits. They're kind of awful, if you ask me, but. Cool. So this caused epidemic amounts of scandal throughout Germany. At the end of the third skit, where he's puking out the spoon, the audience started screaming out, harder, go harder. And then a group of women went to nearby pubs and gathered up all the women they could find and brought them together. And then they stormed on the stage and they cut the power and they took the microphone and they turned on the lights and they said, you're all rapists, you're all sexists, this is unacceptable, we can't have this in our space. They forced them to stop. Interviewing those people later, they said, yeah, actually, it wasn't actually rape, but We didn't want it to happen, so we stopped it. Or again, when I talked to number 16, who also was involved in going on the stage, she said, look, we were the better people. We knew what was morally right. And so we had to stop this. So we just stopped it because it didn't fit in our worldview, basically. This should have been a debate, and it was a debate. The debate went for 3 or 4 hours that night. But by the end of the night, people were calling it rape, and people were calling it sexual assault. Now, this got picked up by major newspapers, and so the major newspapers in Germany were saying this band is showing pornographic rape on stage. The left-wingers are all about rape now. The scandal explodes. The autonom are coordinated, so all across Germany, every city has different centers, and they all talk to each other. And so they started coordinating cancellations of all of the shows of this band across the country. And this got a little bit out of hand. And so in Hamburg, I wish Marius was here. Marius is from Hamburg and wears his St. Pauli t-shirt all the time. But in Hamburg, there's a football club, and it's a left-wing football club. And it's St. Pauli. And they're anti-fascists, so left-wingers who say, we stop Nazis, which is legit. And so that football club has a newspaper, and that newspaper published an article, and they criticized this overreaction. And they said, look, this is men making fun of men, like men walking around with giant penises and stripping. That was them making fun of themselves. They said, look, there was no rape. Where was the rape here? This man asked a woman to penetrate him. She did. He puked out a spoon. It was in very poor taste. It was stupid, but it wasn't assault. The band also released statements saying, look, we're men making fun of men, we're taking the piss out of ourselves, we're saying that men are ridiculous and have overinflated egos and think their penises are super important. But it wasn't rape, it was a stupid parody of gender relations. So the newspaper has released this criticism. Within a couple of, this is the Fanladen. Maybe you've heard of St. Pauli, maybe you've seen this logo. The left-wing football club, it's like second or third tier. They're not very good, but they're very political, and Hamburgers love them. This is their office, which I've been to. It's quite nice. As a result, no, that's not it yet. Their office was attacked. 4 women from the group went to this football office and poured butyric acid all over it, and vandalized it, and plastered the windows with posters explaining sexism. Which was pretty horrific. Butyric acid is pretty difficult to get rid of. And the people who worked in the fan club were hospitalized because of this attack. So it was, I would say, a bit of an overreaction. And so then we have this huge schism within the left where these people who are hardcore anti-fascists, like they're just as radically left as the other people, they get into a fight. Whereas up until now, they've always worked together and coordinated on campaigns and tried to stop Nazis in their free time together. Now they are fighting with each other, saying, look, you guys are being dogmatists. This is ridiculous. This is no longer democracy. Like, we're all about being radical democracy, right? We're all about more democracy, less capitalism. But this is the opposite, is what they had to say. So they have a huge scandal where democratic dialogue and democratic language, where one group says, no, I think you're wrong, and this is why, in a newspaper, are attacked viciously and savagely for voicing their opinions. And so you have sort of an utter breakdown of language and an utter breakdown of dialogue, which I think is the first step towards a really horrible kind of violence, like we saw in the 70s. Situation got worse. This makes me so angry that I didn't translate it, so I'll summarize it. 2 days later, the singer in the band was accused of raping a woman a few months earlier. I, as a historian, take absolutely no stance on whether or not this occurred, because I can't know that. I do know that the accusation came out in the context of basically a witch hunt and a really lynch mob mentality against this band member and against this band. So it's very likely it did occur. Maybe it didn't occur. I'm not going to say. The woman then refused to ever speak or say anything. And the band kept writing to newspapers and editors and magazines and groups saying, please talk to us. Please talk to us. We want to talk about this. And no one would ever talk to them. They finally released a statement which was faxed to the different centers. And he said, he gave his account. He said, look, we were all drinking after a show. She invited us back to her place. She invited us all to sleep in her bed. We all slept in her bed. We cuddled and kind of touched all night. In the morning, she was gone. I woke up. She came back to bed. It started again. We had sex. She never said no. She put the condom on, never said no. I didn't think of it again. again, this could be systemic violence. This could be a man using the discursive language to come out as very reasonable, whereas the woman who's been traumatized is so hurt and so damaged and so violated that she can't speak. That could also be happening here, and that's also part of this systemic violence that you have to keep in mind. So this could have been, and he was accused of using language and using systemic violence to make his voice heard and to discredit her by coming across as a calm, rational man as opposed to the hysterical, emotional female. And that's a trope we've had in feminism for a couple hundred years now. But maybe it was also a witch hunt. We won't know. What I do know is that as a result, the violence and the assaults became really, really, really extreme. So in addition to this butyric acid attack, you've got the band members being attacked with rotten eggs, their tour vans being destroyed on multiple occasions, their windows being smashed, covered in paint, covered in acid. They've been personally threatened with violence. All of their friends have been put under pressure. There was one scandal where a guy mixed the sound on a CD with a band who had a member who had once worked with the band. And that guy who mixed the sound was threatened with violence. So it got really, really extreme. Anyone accused of cooperating them was told they were cooperating with rapists. The Rosa Flora had night patrols through the neighborhood. And those night patrols found people from the fan club, the football club, and beat them so badly they were hospitalized. Which was for me really, really, really hard to write about personally. That someone who likes football could be attacked because the editor of a magazine that happened to share the same office said, "Hey guys, you're overreacting here." And they were sent to the hospital. People who worked with him, like on their road crew or were associated with the road crew, other communities tried to make them lose their jobs, take away their forms of livelihood, get them fired, get them forced out, make them lose their homes, etc. It was really, really horrible. So why did this happen? Like, why did this rather horrific form of no longer structural violence, but really nasty subjective violence start to happen? And it all comes down to this concept called Definitionsmacht, which you would translate as the right to choose, or the right to define, I guess. So in the movement, this was that women had the absolute right to define what is assault, no matter what. And so this was attempted as an inversion, and I think it was really well intended, because you have the idea that if, say, I go and make an accusation of rape, the police are going to ask me what I wore. They're going to ask me what I was doing. They're going to ask me if I asked for it. They're going to take my statement and not tell me it's my statement and then use it in court to make me look confused. They're going to say, was the car yellow or was the car green? See, you're lying. They're going to say you're hysterical. All of these systematic forms are going to be used against me, and I'm not going to be believed. And the left said this is oppression against women. This is one of our 3 forms of violence that we have to stop, is the oppression of women. So to stop this from happening, anytime a woman makes an accusation, we believe her, because that way we're inverting this violence. We're doing counter-violence by believing the victim. I think that's noble, and they thought it was noble, and they thought it was moral, and they thought it was good. They really did. But at the same time, as part of this logic of absolutism and absolute purity, even speaking about it or asking questions is the same as perpetrating it. So they said it re-traumatizes the victim, and it repeats the oppression of women. So if you say you were raped and I ask you a question, I'm then raping you again. And that was the logic. But again, it comes back to this consistency, this absolute purity. That poster at the time was posted on the building saying no means no, even when she didn't say no. And so, I mean, for me, this is very, very hard to talk about and very hard to write about, because of course I support women's right to define, and of course I support feminism. But at the same time, this is a really hard example within history to try to deal with what's going on here. Newspaper editors refused to talk to the band. They couldn't get anyone to engage in conversation with them. They ended up breaking up and then forming a new band, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to look at the case of number 18. We'll call him number 18, yeah. And I asked number 18 about this. And I asked him, what does he think? And he said, if it was, I will get to that. He said, yep, Definitionsmacht. If it happened, it happened. The woman has to be believed no matter what. No matter what we believe her, we throw the guy out and we attack him, period. But why this was so interesting is number 18 was also accused of rape. In 1996, a woman made an accusation against him, but she didn't make it out loud. She made it, her new boyfriend let it be known. And so it was a little bit shady to begin with. He was then thrown out, and all sorts of sanctions against him as well. But what makes this example really, really difficult / complicated is that he didn't do it. And we know that he didn't do it because the woman later confessed that she'd made it up. And she said she made it up because her new partner accused her of cheating on him. And to get out of the cheating claim, because she'd broken up with the new partner, got back together with the old guy, broken up with the old guy, got back to the new guy a couple of times. And in one of these interludes, the new boyfriend said that's cheating. And she said, no, it was rape. I wasn't cheating on you. And then all of this violence was then applied to number 18 as well. So in this case, we have this really complicated example where the woman has to be believed 100%, and that's the purity and the ideology of this movement. But the woman lied, and we found out that she lied. Number 11 lived with, did he live with number 18? He lived with number 18's wife at the time and his sister. So they were really, really, really close friends. And I asked number 11 about this, and he said, yeah, it was really hard, but if it's the woman says it, he's thrown out. And when the woman lied, still thrown out. And so this really hard example of this sort of purity and absolutism as a reaction of this principle. Because he explains, look, if any one person, if only one man, or perhaps woman, was falsely accused and that comes to light, then every woman who ever is accused is going to be asked what she wore. Is she lying? Did she ask for it? Was she flirting? Was she drinking? And so we need to invert that absolutely. And so we engage in this policy. And it's a moral policy. And I can see where they're coming from. If a woman says it's rape, it simply is, and we cannot talk about it. But what really interests me and what I get into more in my work, which I won't bring up here because it has to do with a lot of political theory, is this question of language. This question of why can't we speak about it? And this question of not speaking is really rampant throughout this whole movement. They refused to negotiate on a lot of points. For example, the state said, do you want this building? You can have it. We'll give it to you. And they said, we don't talk to the state. And so it's a cycle that's really, really problematic for historians because we deal with language. So again, I asked number 18 with this background about the band. And he said, if a woman says it's rape, it's rape. And we have to keep purity. We have to keep the movement pure, we have to keep the space pure, we have to keep ourselves pure, and we can't have any of this contamination, we can't have any of these influences because we're morally superior for being pure. He also said, but it was Stalinism and dogmatism and we were completely undemocratic assholes. But he still adhered to the principle. And that's what I found really fascinating. And in trying to write this paper where I'm basically saying there's a new kind of structural violence coming out of counterviolence, and it has to do with the formation of the self. And I know that for a group of scientists, you don't, there's not a lot of context there, but that's a new thing in history. No one's really said that before. People say, look, there's counterviolence, there's structural violence, there's objective violence, but no one says, yeah, but the self becomes the weapon. And that's what I'm trying to argue here. And I find it really helpful to explain that to audiences because it really helps me to teach myself what I'm saying to make sure it makes sense. So please tell me afterwards if it makes sense because I'm publishing this in April and I'd love feedback and to know if it makes sense and is clear. So you have a situation where democratic dialogue is eliminated, but there's also no rehabilitation process. And there was another group in Germany, in Göttingen, which is another really radical city at the time, and they had a similar situation. And so they said, no, we're going to get a lawyer, a left-wing lawyer in here, and we'll have some sort of principle of justice where the man gets a chance to defend himself. And they were condemned and damned and told they were repeating violence and repeating the oppression of women because you can't have any speech whatsoever. It has to be pure. It has to be absolute. So what I'm arguing, and what I argue in this book chapter, is that counterviolence against this type of structural violence ultimately becomes something called subjective violence, where I punch you in the face. And we enter into a dialectic here. Has anyone read Hegel? You have a circle and things cycle around. They ultimately make new syntheses, although that's super problematic and I don't want to inflict Hegel on you. But you end up in this reciprocal relationship, right? Where things turn into other things because they're reacting. And so you have a relationship where their attempt to engage in this counterviolence of what was really a noble good, I think, of we believe women, period, becomes a very, very brutal subjective violence where they sent people to hospital for having these opinions. And I talked to number 16 about this, and she said, look, in this whole conflict, I always had the opinion that we were just destroying people and absolutely, just completely destroying them. and we attack them, we attack their lives, we attack their psyches, and it had nothing more to do with what we had tried to do in the beginning, with this moral idea of making a better world where we wouldn't have these sorts of violence anymore. I asked number 18, and he said the same thing. He said, look, it was well-intentioned, we were trying to save women, we were trying to protect women, but it was absolutely no longer emancipatory. The idea was good, but what we did with it was wrong. I'm putting this in the context of a philosopher who says something sort of similar, and he talks about ethnic cleansing. And he says, when the Jews wanted to when the Nazis wanted to purge all the Jews from Germany, they weren't eliminating a foreigner. It wasn't a foreign outside state-like influence. It was something within you. You know, the Jews had lived there for hundreds of years. They all spoke German. They were integrated. But it was this idea of sort of purging the contaminants within yourself. Or if we ethnically cleansed Britain of Swedish people, they've been living here for 100 years, they're integrated, they're citizens. It's not, stopping ISIS. Now it is ISIS, right? That's a terrible example. It's not stopping the Russians. It's purging the example from within you. Like, think about ISIS. Why are people so scared of ISIS? Because those people live here and look like us. They're part of us. It's not a foreign element anymore. It's an internal, something internal that makes you impure, that breaks you from the inside. And that's where this turn in violence is going. And I think that's super, super relevant today for the immigration crises, for crises of religion and the wars of religion we're starting to see, for anti-foreigner sentiment sweeping Europe, for Brexit. What is it about the Polish worker who's been here for 50 years that's such a problem? Why does it threaten you so much? And it threatens you because it's yourself. It's not the Russian that you can see across the world, it's yourself. And that's what's so scary about it. This is an ethnic cleansing of foreign impulses, and that's what's going on here. I'm going to end on one last quote from one of the women who also stormed up on the stage. And she said, look, I have to actually confess that often I realize that the slogans that I scream about and that I write about, that I chant about, they often deviate from my actual practice a lot. Number 16 says this too, as does number 17, who's another woman in a similar situation. She said, often I'm really afraid of this. This really, really scares me, this about myself. She said, I don't find it good, and I want to be different, and I'm just not there yet, but I'm still developing myself. I'm still trying to form myself to get there. And then she goes on in the interview to say, but I would never tell anyone this. I would never say this. I would never admit this. In the plenum and in the group, I am rah, 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 rah. And I would never tell anyone this because they would throw me out and I'd be terrified. So in a very, hopefully not patronizing summary, we've talked about structural and objective violence, these two kinds of violence. We've talked about ways that counterviolence sought to escape this, first peacefully, and then through terrorism. Then everybody died and it didn't work. So instead of terrorizing the outside, they started terrorizing the inside, and became about creating oneself in the Foucauldian sense as a pure subject. And that they had really, really moral goals of inverting structural violence, more sexism, oppression, racism. They really, really were trying to fix these things. And they really were trying to protect women. But this ultimately became a refusal of democratic language and dialogue, and I would say thus democracy itself. And I think ultimately, and I'm using Balibar to argue this, it came to resemble the same subjective violence that it had sought to counter in the beginning. So that's it, I'm done. Thanks for listening, guys.